I'm Isaac Nightshade. Tonight's descent is into the Blood Mirror, Chronicles of the Dark Multiverse, a psychological horror tale where mirrors don't reflect reality. They rewrite it. When you stand before the Blood Mirror, you think you're looking into it, but it's already inside you. Elijah came searching for answers, maybe redemption. What he found was a house that shifts when you blink, a reflection that learns, and a multiverse that remembers every version of him, even the ones that never should have existed. Chapter 1. A flicker in the glass. The house was still, not silent. No, it was never truly silent, but still like something holding its breath. Outside, the wind moved through the surrounding forest like a great, tired thing, dragging its limbs through brittle underbrush. It moaned low and long beneath the eaves of the house, pressing against the aging structure in rhythmic, half-hearted pulses. It had done this for decades, maybe longer. The house had listened. Elijah Rook stepped over a fallen lampshade, the dust kicked up by his movement turning silver in the morning light. He had not spoken aloud since entering the house an hour ago, when the estate lawyer handed him the key with a brisk nod and a strange, fleeting glance, as if afraid to make eye contact for too long. The air inside was cool but sour, like something kept closed for too long. Time hung here in corners, slumped in chairs, coiled under floorboards. He moved slowly, as though his limbs were remembering how to function in this particular place. He paused by a staircase, staring up into darkness that pooled at the top like ink. The old wood groaned beneath his feet, groaned again when he shifted weight. A slow breath escaped him. He didn't remember inhaling. He didn't remember the last 2 weeks, if he was honest. There had been doctors, a facility with beige walls, a woman with soft eyes who said he had lost coherence. Elijah didn't like the word facility. It made the experience sound sterile. It wasn't. But this house, that word rang too loud in his head, inherited, was real if not entirely believable. No one had ever mentioned a great-uncle. No family tree had included an Edward Rook. Yet the deed, the letters, the box of brittle photographs, all said otherwise. The house was his now. He couldn't have said why he came. Maybe some part of him thought it was safer than staying put. Or maybe it had, called to him in a way he couldn't admit, even to himself. He climbed the stairs, one hand brushing the banister as he went. The wood felt oddly warm. The attic door was a thin panel at the end of the hall, crooked in its frame. It resisted his hand, then relented with a brittle pop, opening into a dark maw that exhaled the scent of old cedar, mildew, and something else, something mineral and sweet. Elijah fumbled for a chain and pulled. A bare bulb flared into life above, swinging, slightly as if recently disturbed. Shadows crawled along the rafters. The attic was cluttered. Boxes, tarps, rusting furniture, a child's broken tricycle. But it was the mirror that stopped him. It stood near the far wall, half-shrouded in a velvet cloth the color of dried blood. Even under layers of dust, it emanated presence, like an animal holding perfectly still. Ornate carvings curled around its frame in baroque swirls, snakes, wings, jagged symbols that looked foreign but eerily familiar, like a language glimpsed in dreams. He hesitated before approaching, drawn and repelled in equal measure. Something in his chest tightened, his hands twitched. He reached out and pulled the cloth away. The mirror blinked at him. No, he blinked. The glass was just glass, surely, but it caught the light strangely. The bulb overhead flickered once, then steadied. His reflection stared back, paler than expected, his eyes darker, hollowed by weeks of poor sleep, and something deeper, something fraying from within. Elijah leaned in. The mirror was old but flawless. No scratches, no signs of wear. Its depth was unsettling, not in the way that mirrors are typically unsettling. This one didn't just reflect, it waited. He turned away. The bulb above swayed slightly, although he hadn't touched it. That night he lay in the narrow bed in the master bedroom, unable to sleep. The house ticked and creaked with a rhythm that felt intentional, as though its groans formed a language not quite meant for human ears. The wind dragged itself across the roof. Somewhere in the attic above, something knocked once, slow and deliberate. He told himself it was just old beams adjusting to temperature. He didn't get up to check. Instead, he lay awake, eyes locked on the ceiling, and tried not to listen too closely to the whispering. He was almost certain it wasn't in his head. Days passed, or seemed to. Time in the house was slippery. The clocks didn't agree with one another, and the sun through the smeared windows never felt quite right. Too red in the mornings, too fast in the evenings. He kept returning to the attic. Each time the mirror greeted him without expression, but something about it shifted when he entered. He began to notice small details, a faint throb along its frame, like veins pulsing beneath wood. A hum so low it registered in his teeth more than his ears. The glass no longer seemed flat, but layered, like looking into water lit from beneath. One morning he found himself already standing in front of it, though he didn't remember climbing the stairs. His reflection looked back at him, more tired than yesterday. He leaned closer. There. A flicker. For the briefest moment, the image warped. Not dramatically, just enough to be wrong. His reflection's eyes twitched away from his own, glancing to the side before snapping back. Elijah flinched, stumbling back into a chair that groaned and collapsed beneath him. The bulb above swung violently now. The attic swam with shadows that shifted, curled. For the first time, Elijah considered smashing the mirror. He even took a step toward it, but paused. His hand trembled. The glass. It looked sick, not cracked, not damaged, but wounded. There was something like bruising near the edges. A dark bloom, barely visible unless you were looking for it. That night, the whispers became clearer. He heard his name once, but distorted, stretched, like something trying to shape itself into human language. He pressed his hands to his ears and wept without understanding why. It was on the 5th morning that it changed. Elijah woke cold, the sheets damp with sweat. He dressed absently and climbed the attic stairs without thought, as if pulled by thread. The mirror was as he'd left it, but the room was wrong. The light had a thickness to it, like water with oil in it. Dust motes hung perfectly still. The air was oppressive. And then he looked and froze. His reflection was not there. The room was, the boxes, the bulb, the tricycle with its warped front wheel. But Elijah himself was missing. There was no figure, no face, no shadow, just the attic, empty and waiting. He stepped left. The mirror showed the same empty room. He raised his hand. Nothing moved. No delay, no glitch. Just absence. He backed away, throat dry, heart thudding, unevenly in his chest. The air had grown colder, and the light bulb above buzzed like an insect trapped in a jar. From the far end of the attic, something shifted, not loudly, just enough to be heard. A soft scuff of movement like bare feet on wood. Elijah turned, but the space was empty. When he looked back at the mirror, the attic was still there, empty as before. But now, there was something in the reflection. A shape in the far corner, still, watching. And it wasn't him. Chapter 2. House of Hollow Echoes. Elijah woke to the sound of ticking. Not the soft, reassuring tick of a bedside clock, but a sharp, irregular tapping, like bone on wood, just beyond the threshold of sleep. He sat up too fast, the air around him tight, his heart knocking around in his chest like something misplaced. The sound stopped. The room exhaled. He glanced at the window. The light outside was wrong again, flat and disinterested, casting no shadows. The branches of the trees beyond trembled without wind. He pressed a hand to his chest, not because he was frightened, not exactly, but because he needed to confirm he was still there. The house felt larger today. It wasn't, of course. It couldn't be. And yet, as he wandered through the first floor, Elijah couldn't shake the sensation that certain rooms had changed in size. The hallway near the pantry was longer than he remembered, its walls stretched like softened wax. A narrow closet by the stairs now opened, into a space he didn't recognize, a tight passage of shelves filled with faded bottles, labeled in cursive script he couldn't quite read. He stared at the labels for a long time, expecting the letters to shift under his gaze. Some of them did. It was stress. That's what he told himself. Lingering damage from the breakdown, a residual fog refusing to lift. His psychiatrist had warned him about cognitive distortions. He'd read the pamphlet, The Brain After Collapse, recognizing perceptual dysfunctions. But the house, this house, didn't feel like a hallucination. It felt aware. In the study, the chair by the fireplace had moved 6 inches to the left. It was such a small thing. He only noticed because he'd measured the distance between the chair's leg and the burn mark in the floor 2 days ago. A nervous habit, a relic from his archiving days, his way of organizing the chaos. The alignment was part of the architecture in his mind now. The misplacement struck him as violently intimate. He stared at the chair for a long time, then reached out and dragged it back. The sound scraped through the room like a scream muffled beneath cotton. He left the study without looking behind him. The journal was worse. He found it in the dining room, lying open on the table, though he remembered writing in it upstairs. The ink was still fresh on the first entry, but the words weren't his. The handwriting looked similar to his own, close enough to be familiar, far enough to be wrong. The loop of the R, the slant of the E, just enough of a difference to make his stomach turn. The sentence read, I saw myself watching from a place I've never been. He turned the page. A second entry, dated today. You've already been here before. Stop pretending you haven't. His hands trembled. He closed the book carefully, as if it might bite. By mid-afternoon, Elijah had stopped turning on the lights. They flickered now when he entered a room. Some stayed on, others dimmed to a sickly orange hue, like flame filtered through old honey. The ceiling fan in the hallway spun counterclockwise, although it wasn't plugged in. The sensation of being watched had grown teeth. He caught it in flashes, the prickling of skin, the sound of breathing in rooms he'd just left. He began whispering aloud to himself as he moved through the halls, just to fill the quiet. I'm still here, he muttered in the kitchen. I'm not gone. A creak sounded above him, exactly 1 second after he spoke. He turned slowly. The light above the pantry door blinked once, then held steady. It was the mirror that made the air thin. By evening, Elijah had returned to the attic, though he hadn't decided to go there. His body moved of its own volition now, tethered by some invisible thread. Each step on the staircase vibrated higher into his skull, like a tuning fork pressed to bone. The attic was colder than the rest of the house. The temperature dropped just past the 3rd step, as if crossing some invisible threshold. He opened the attic door. The mirror stood waiting, half in shadow. It no longer reflected the room perfectly. Shadows curled at the edges like frost, patterns moving against the grain. Elijah stepped closer. He didn't see himself. Instead, the mirror reflected a hallway he didn't recognize. Narrow, endless. lit by lamps that flickered in perfect unison, casting long, exaggerated shadows. The walls were dark, marked with strange handprints. The floor gleamed like wet stone. Elijah blinked. The reflection did not change. He reached out. The glass rippled once, faintly, as if disturbed by breath. A low hum filled the attic, so deep it vibrated in his molars. He stepped back. The mirror showed the corridor still. The lights in the image flickered rhythmically, like a heartbeat. He could almost hear them clicking. He leaned closer, drawn, into the rhythm, into the depth, and then the lights in the hallway turned off. One by one, from far down the corridor, something began to move, slowly, heavily, closer. The hum in the attic rose. The air thickened. Elijah couldn't look away. His skin felt too tight. The thing in the mirror didn't have a shape, not exactly. It was more an absence of light, a distortion of form. But it moved like it knew him, like it had been looking for him for a long, long time. His breath caught in his throat. He reached again, though he didn't know why. His fingertips brushed the glass, and the lights in the attic went out. Chapter 3. The man in the mirror isn't me. It began with a smile, not Elijah's. His mouth was still pressed into a tight, habitual line, but the reflections, a twitch at first, barely there, then unmistakable. The corners of the mouth lifting, teeth just visible, a knowing grin that didn't belong to him. Elijah froze. He was standing in the attic again, too early for the sun, too late for the night. The window behind him cast no light. The mirror was darker now, the glass slightly tinted like aged water, and the reflection inside it. He wasn't sure what he was seeing. The version of himself in the mirror didn't move when he raised his hand. It stood, arms at its sides, watching. Head tilted just a fraction too far, like a curious dog. The eyes, his eyes, were too bright, too focused. The pupils slightly larger than they should have been, swallowing too much of the iris. The smile widened. Elijah stepped back. His reflection did not. He didn't remember walking downstairs. But when he found himself in the kitchen, the coffee pot was already half full. Steam curled from it like breath. The mug in his hand was warm. He sat in silence, sipping bitter liquid that tasted faintly metallic, and watched the kitchen walls for movement. The house had grown quieter. No more ticks or groans, no shifting pipes. Just stillness, as if it, too, were watching. He glanced at the small mirror above the sink. The man in the glass was just Elijah again. Blank-eyed, hollow, normal. He didn't go to the attic that day, but he thought about it more than once. Felt the gravity of it, the pull, like something whispering in a voice too faint to understand. That night he tried to test it. He brought his phone, hand trembling as he climbed the attic stairs. The light from the bulb flickered softly above him. The mirror stood silent, still, like it had been waiting. Elijah took a step closer and held the phone up. The reflection was him again. No grin, no strange movement, just his tired face. He hesitated, then pressed the shutter. The camera clicked. He lowered the phone and frowned. The screen displayed something else entirely. The image was smeared, not in a motion blur or bad focus, but wrong, fundamentally corrupted. His face was warped, twisted sideways. The eyes were two empty voids leaking dark static. Blood-red lines spidered across the screen like veins, crawling from the corners. Behind his distorted figure, the attic was changed, walls split with cracks, shadows hanging like wet sheets. He tried to take another. The screen flashed red. The photo disappeared. Only a single word remained in a glitched font. Trapped. He didn't sleep that night. When he lay down, the ceiling seemed to pulse with breath. The bed shifted subtly beneath him, like something sleeping just beneath the mattress. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like footsteps that didn't stop at the doorframe. Elijah kept the light on. His eyes never left the mirror across the room. And yet, sometime in the early hours, he found himself dreaming. Not the disjointed nonsense of a tired mind, but vivid, linear, precise. He was in the attic again, only this time the air was dense and sweet, like rotting fruit. The bulb overhead flickered rhythmically, and he stood in front of the mirror. His reflection was there, grinning again, wider. This time, mouth stretched too far. "I'm not trapped in here," the other Elijah whispered. The voice didn't come from the mirror. It came from beside him. From inside him. "You are." The reflection's grin cracked further, splitting at the edges, revealing teeth behind teeth. Then, without warning, it moved, fast, too fast, and slammed its palm against the glass. The sound echoed like a bell underwater. Elijah woke with his own scream lodged in his throat, sweat cooling fast on his skin. He reached for the lamp. It didn't turn on. The next day, mirrors were everywhere. Or maybe they had always been there and he had never noticed. Small ones, round ones, silver-backed, antique, cloudy with age. One above the fireplace, two on either side of the stairwell. A full-length one at the end of the second-floor hallway he was sure hadn't existed the day before. In each one, his reflection watched him too closely. No movement out of place, nothing overt, but something in the posture, the way the head tilted, the subtle delay in blinking. It all made him nauseous. Elijah stopped looking after a while. He moved through the house with his eyes to the floor. He began covering mirrors with towels, old sheets, anything to block the gaze. It made him feel ridiculous, but it was better than the alternative. Until he reached the attic again. He hadn't meant to. He wasn't even sure how he'd ended up at the top of the stairs, hand resting on the door frame, staring into the dark. The cloth he'd thrown over the blood mirror was gone. The mirror stood bare, and Elijah was already walking toward it. The reflection smiled again. This time Elijah smiled back, just to see what would happen. Nothing. No reaction. The reflection's grin stayed sharp, teeth perfectly white. The eyes sparkled as if amused by the gesture. Then, without warning, the mirror Elijah turned his head, away from him. It looked to the left, toward something Elijah couldn't see. His breath caught. He tried to mimic it, to look where the reflection was looking. But when he did, there was nothing there, just the attic wall. He turned back. The reflection was gone. The mirror showed only the room, but not this version of the room. The walls were darker, slick with something wet and glistening. The bulb above swung wildly, casting frantic shadows across jagged furniture. The tricycle in the corner had rusted, its wheels bent like bones, and something moved at the edge of the frame. Elijah leaned in, transfixed. The air grew thicker, his lungs slow to respond. And then, a hand, pressed flat against the glass from the inside. It was his hand. But his own hand had never looked like that. The skin was pale, too pale, stretched tight over long, bony fingers. Black veins crawled beneath the surface, and the nails were wrong. They were sharp. The hand slowly curled into a fist, then knocked once, on the inside, as if asking to be let out. Elijah stumbled back, heart punching his ribs. He turned and ran. That night, there was no rest. Sleep hovered just beyond reach, taunting him. When he finally drifted, he returned to that corridor from before, the one in the mirror. The lights clicked out one by one behind him. Footsteps echoed somewhere ahead. And then, around the corner, he saw himself, but not the way he expected. This version was different, more real, than any mirror image had ever been. Hair slicked back, jaw tighter, eyes full of something unrecognizable. The other, Elijah held a knife. "Time to trade places," he whispered. Chapter 4. Blood seeped through the frame. Elijah first noticed the stains in the morning, though at first he thought they were shadows. A patch of wood just beneath the mirror had darkened overnight. At a glance, it looked like dampness, some slow leak from a pipe above the attic. But when he knelt to inspect it, running 2 fingers lightly across the boards, the wood felt dry, warm even. When he held his fingers up to the light, he saw the smear, a thin, rust-colored residue that smelled faintly of iron and something else, something sweet and wrong. It was not water. By the end of the week, the stain had grown. No matter how often he scrubbed it, vinegar, bleach, even sandpaper, it remained, not spreading in a way he could observe, but always slightly larger each time he looked, like it waited until he blinked. He stopped trying after a while. What was the point? The mirror remained its usual self, if such a thing could be said now. Half-reflective, half-consuming. Sometimes it showed him, sometimes it didn't. He had stopped trusting it to tell him the truth, and he had stopped trusting himself not to look. The house had taken on a heaviness, the kind of thick silence that blanketed everything, even thought. Elijah noticed the clocks had all stopped at slightly different times. The one in the hallway read 3:17, the kitchen 12:03. His watch had gone blank entirely. He didn't know what day it was. He began finding objects in the wrong rooms, his shoes placed beside the bathtub, a candle on his pillow, still warm at the base, pages torn from his journal tucked into the freezer. The worst part, the handwriting on those pages wasn't always his. One afternoon, or what he assumed was afternoon, Elijah discovered the second journal. It had fallen behind the dresser in the attic, the corner barely visible beneath a collapsed pile of yellowed newspapers. The leather binding was brittle and soft with age warped from moisture, or maybe heat. There was no name on the cover, no title. Inside, the writing was frantic, slanted, urgent. Some pages were scrawled over with large X's, others soaked with what appeared to be the same rust-colored fluid seeping beneath the mirror. It watches even when you cover it. There is no glass, only a membrane. Reflections are anchors, and anchors rot. Each entry read like a mind unraveling, but in ways too familiar for Elijah to dismiss. One passage repeated over several pages. Fractured reflections. Realms bleeding into ours. Do not sleep in sight of the glass. Elijah began waking in unfamiliar places. The first time he found himself seated at the top of the stairs, upright, fully clothed, clutching a candle that had burned down to a curled wick. The flame had long since gone out. His feet were cold. His mouth was dry. The second time he woke in the attic. The mirror stood silent. He was lying on the floor. Beside it, cheek pressed against the blackening boards, the smell of iron thick in his nose. When he sat up, he saw bloody streaks along the floor, finger trails uneven and desperate. He checked his hands. Clean. The third time he woke standing, in the hallway just outside the bathroom, holding his phone. The camera app was open. The front-facing viewfinder displayed an image of him, smiling even though he wasn't. He stopped sleeping. He told himself it was safer. He boiled. Tea he didn't drink. Sat in the kitchen and listened to the house breathe around him. The walls groaned more now. Not with age, but with intention. There was a rhythm to it, a slow inhale and exhale that matched the throbbing behind his eyes. Sometimes he could feel it in the soles of his feet, like the floorboards were pulsing. Sometimes he could hear the mirror muttering, not in words, not exactly, more like wet syllables, trying to make sense of a mouth it didn't have. It was during one of these half-waking vigils that Elijah noticed the reflection had changed again. The mirror, at first glance, showed only the attic. Normal. Still. But then, at the far edge, near the bottom corner, something shimmered. A footstep. Faint. A smudge of movement. He stared for several minutes, willing the glass to be honest. Then slowly, deliberately, the reflection tilted. Not the mirror itself, but the perspective inside it, as if a camera angle had shifted, panning slightly to reveal more of the room. And there, just visible in the corner, was a figure, motionless, wearing his clothes, head cocked at that same unnatural angle, watching, waiting. Elijah ran. He left the attic and didn't return for hours. He sat in the hallway, knees to his chest, the journal open in his lap, but he couldn't bring himself to read. The walls pulsed again, now faster. A heartbeat not his own. He could feel it in his throat. When he finally opened his eyes, it was dark. The candle beside him had burned out, the wax a collapsed tower on the floor. His body ached, his joints felt misaligned. The silence was worse now, not absence, expectancy. He climbed the stairs slowly, breath held, each step longer than it should have been. The attic door creaked open. The mirror was gone. The cloth he'd once tried to cover it with lay curled like shed skin in the corner. The wall where it had stood was blank. At least, it should have been, but he could still see his reflection, suspended in mid-air, hanging just where the glass used to be. The reflection stood in the empty frame of space, arms at its sides, a grin slowly creeping across its face. It raised a hand and waved. Elijah didn't move. The reflection did, and then it took a step forward, through nothing, through air. Chapter 5. The Mirror Remembers. Elijah avoided the mirrors now, but they didn't avoid him. They found him in spoons, in puddles, in windows darkened by storm clouds. Any surface that hinted at a shine seemed to take on a shape, a shimmer, and then show him something that didn't belong, something that wasn't here. It began slowly, a smear of skyline where a cupboard door reflected the kitchen light, crumbling towers in the dull silver rim of a serving tray, the curve of a broken moon seen in a fogged bathroom mirror, hanging low in a charred, ash-colored sky. Each glimpse came with a sound, a hum, low and mournful, like a voice speaking just below comprehension. He began walking faster past anything that could cast him back at himself. But sometimes he caught them anyway. And what disturbed him more than anything was the familiarity. These places, these worlds, or pieces of them, they weren't entirely foreign. Not to him. Something inside him tensed, not from fear, but from recognition, as if some slivered part of him remembered them, as if he had already been there. It was on one of these long, murky days, with the house humming like a dying organ around him, that he met her. He was in the garden behind the estate, or what was left of it. The hedges had decayed into wild, gnarled spines. The statue near the broken fountain had crumbled. The wind had turned erratic, lifting in gusts that didn't match the sky's stillness. She was standing near the willow tree, back straight, hands clasped. Elijah didn't hear her approach. One moment he was alone, the next she was there. She looked like she belonged to another time, though not in the way old photographs do. She had that stillness Elijah associated with portraits in forgotten museums. Her clothes were slightly tattered at the edges, colorless in the gray light. "I lived here once," she said without turning. Elijah froze. Her voice was sharp but breathy, like the last notes of a violin. "You," he began. She turned. She was not beautiful, not in any earthly sense. Her eyes were too pale, like frost forming over dark stone. Her mouth didn't move quite right when she smiled. Too slow, too deliberate. "The mirror remembers," she said. Elijah opened his mouth, closed it again. The wind stilled. "How do you know about the mirror?" She tilted her head, an echo of the gesture his reflection had worn days ago. "You don't know what it is," she said. "You think it's a window. It's a wound." He took a step forward. She didn't move. "Who are you?" "I told you. I lived here. Before the others. Before the glass turned to skin." Elijah felt the temperature drop. He looked at the house behind him, tall, gray, watching. "What do you mean, wound?" She took a step closer. "You've felt it, haven't you? The seepage, the bleed. What you're seeing, what you think are other places, are just pieces of a tear that never healed. That mirror?" She pointed toward the upper floor. "It remembers everything that's come through, and everything that never left." Elijah felt lightheaded. "Why me?" "Because it opened to you. Because something in you let it. The fracture doesn't choose randomly. It wants echoes." He took another step forward, but the ground beneath him felt less certain, like the garden might tip sideways at any moment. "What is the fracture?" Now she looked at him directly. Her eyes were bottomless. "It's the place where all mirrors break." They walked in silence to the back door. She moved like a ghost, but felt real beside him, her shoulder brushing his once cold as river stones. He could smell earth and smoke on her clothes. Her hair smelled like candle wax. Inside the house, the shadows deepened. She seemed unaffected by them. "The first time I heard the mirror speak," she said, running her fingers along the wall, "it said my name backwards. Then it showed me what I would become if I stayed." Elijah followed her up the stairs, not asking why. In the hallway, the lights were off. A long mirror hung at the end, one Elijah had draped in a sheet days earlier. Now the cloth was on the floor. The glass shimmered faintly. The hallway behind them was reflected, but they weren't. She faced the mirror, speaking softly. "It's thin tonight. You can feel it, can't you?" Elijah nodded before he realized he had. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, rusted penknife. "I tried to leave once," she said, voice trembling now for the first time. "But the fracture doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive." Before he could stop her, she dragged the blade across her palm. Blood welled instantly, thick and dark. She raised her hand and pressed it against the mirror. The glass rippled, not like water, more like a plastic membrane stretched over a breathing chest. The reflection caught fire. Not literal flame, but a lightless, pulsing glow that moved through the hallway, revealing flashes behind the glass. Other halls, other rooms, charred doorways, things with too many limbs dragging themselves through ash. Elijah reached for her. "Wait, what are you—" She looked at him once more. "If you go through," she whispered, "don't follow your own voice. It lies." And then she stepped into the mirror. Not through a portal, not with ceremony. She simply vanished. No splash, no scream. Just a folding of space and a shadow left behind, fading like breath on glass. Elijah staggered backward. The hallway lights flared once, then died. In the mirror, his reflection returned, alone and smiling. Chapter 6. Host of the Other Side. He didn't remember the moment his body crossed. It was like a second eyelid opening in his mind, a click, soft and hollow. The sensation of falling, but not through space, through sense. A slide away from meaning. One breath still in the hallway, the next inside something else. Elijah stood now in the mirror's world, though he wasn't sure how he could be standing. The laws of balance, direction, time, none felt reliable. The air clung to him, viscous and warm, heavy with a chemical sweetness that reminded him of funeral homes and rotted citrus. A long hallway stretched out in both directions. The floor was damp beneath his feet, slick with a dark residue that trailed in veins across the wood. Above him, the ceiling sagged with vines as thick as wrists, twitching gently, as if reacting to his presence. His house, but reversed, twisted, buried under something organic and ancient. He was inside a wound. He touched the wall. It was soft. It pulsed beneath his fingertips. Elijah pulled his hand back and stared at it. A red smear bloomed across his palm. Not paint, not dirt, blood. Fresh. There was no silence here. Not truly. The air was alive with sound, though none of it made sense. Murmuring, constant and shapeless, like a room full of people whispering names in a language he didn't know. From behind closed doors he heard weeping, laughter, screams. He didn't try the doors. They looked wrong, arched too tall, knobs melted into the wood like tumors. One throbbed as he passed, like it was breathing. He made his way toward the staircase, but the steps were covered in thick, root-like tendrils that squirmed at the edges, like earthworms dragged into slow motion. The smell worsened the higher he climbed, something fungal, sour, and spoiled. At the top, the hallway stretched longer than he remembered. He began to doubt whether he'd ever left the house, whether he'd ever entered the mirror at all. That was when he heard it, a slow, dragging sound, and a voice. Elijah. He froze. The voice came from ahead, but it didn't bounce or echo the way it should have. It landed flat, close, familiar. It spoke his name again, but with a weight behind it, like a prayer said in reverse. He turned the corner. There he stood, himself, and not. This other Elijah leaned against the doorframe to what should have been the attic. He was, dressed the same hair, same posture, but the resemblance was skin-deep. His eyes were wrong, too wide, ringed in black. They burned with something ancient and gleeful. A grin split his face, slow and sure. Elijah, the figure said, or rather the version wearing that name. Elijah backed up half a step. Who are you? The man straightened. I'm the firstborn. The words landed with the finality of a locked door. I'm what's left when the self cracks, the part that sees clearly, the one who watches while the others rot. What do you mean, others? The firstborn smile deepened. You didn't think you were the only one, did you? You're not a person. You're a filter, a thin membrane stretched over something older. We all are. You're just the next. I'm not. Elijah started, but the firstborn raised a hand. No, you're not. Not you, the man standing here, asking questions like they matter. You're the shell, a failed attempt. But not useless. You're the host. The house creaked around them, and Elijah realized it was the firstborn who made it do that. His presence pressed on the space around him, distorting it. Walls bent inward. The floor warped beneath his boots. He tried to move, but his legs felt heavy, as though something had woven itself around his muscles in the moments he'd stood still. The firstborn took a step forward. The shadows curled behind him. You've been bleeding through for days, he said. Every glimpse, every whisper. It was the body preparing for the soul. Elijah's voice caught. Why me? Because you looked, the firstborn said. That's always the start. He reached out then, palm open, fingers too long, the nails slightly split down the center. You don't have to fight it. You're already hollow. Let us finish what we started." Elijah turned and ran. The hallway shifted beneath him, twisting, elongating, rising into impossible angles. Doors blinked in and out of existence. The vines clawed at his feet. He stumbled through rooms where the windows showed endless skies filled with flying things, winged shadows, circling ruins in slow, deliberate spirals. The mirrors were everywhere now, embedded in walls, floors, ceilings, small ones, wide ones, full length, and every single one of them reflected not just Elijah, but versions of him. In one he was burned, scalp scorched, eyes melted into red sockets. In another he wore a crown of teeth, smiling into a red fog. One Elijah stood against a field of black glass, hands outstretched, mouth screaming, but soundless. In every reflection he saw not himself, but possibilities, horrors he had been, or would be, or already was. The hallway ended in a circular chamber. Mirrors lined the walls, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They shimmered faintly, pulsing like heartbeats. He turned slowly. Every mirror was watching him, and in every one a different Elijah stared back. They moved independently. One laughed, another wept, a third scratched at the glass, leaving long streaks. One stood utterly still, eyes black, mouth sewn shut with wire, and one of them, one near the center, was smiling, the firstborn. Elijah backed into the middle of the room, and the mirrors began to speak. Not words, not really, but himself speaking in too many voices, from too many mouths, echoes of memories twisted into lies. You never left the hospital. She never loved you. You were never real. This is the house. This is the home. We're coming through. Elijah covered his ears, fell to his knees, and the mirrors screamed. All at once. Chapter 7. The Fracture. Worsens. Elijah came back to the house the way some people come back to their bodies after near death, uncertain if they were supposed to return at all. He wasn't sure how he crossed back. The transition from mirror world to real world had no door, no warning. One moment he was surrounded by warped versions of himself, screaming from 1,000 panes of glass. The next, he was waking in the hallway on the second floor, his face pressed to the cold wood, the scent of iron and mildew in his nose, a slick trail of something wet across his cheek. There was no mirror on the wall anymore, but he could still feel it behind his eyes. Watching, whispering. Time no longer moved in whole days. It came in fractures. Elijah would blink and find himself in the kitchen with a knife in his hand, cutting something he didn't remember buying. Or he'd wake up in the tub, fully clothed, the faucet dripping a slow, metallic rhythm that aligned too perfectly with his heartbeat. He began forgetting the names of things. He looked at the lamp in the living room and couldn't remember what it was called. He stared at his own reflection in a puddle near the back door and didn't recognize the shape of his face. Sometimes he didn't know the house at all. Other times he remembered it in too much detail, patterns in the wallpaper that hadn't existed before, symbols beneath the peeling paint that pulsed in his peripheral vision, but vanished when he turned to look. The ceilings seemed lower 1 hour, impossibly high the next. Some doors opened into brick, some into other rooms, and one, once, opened into nothing at all. Just wind and the sound of distant, cracking laughter. The mirror had not stopped speaking. It didn't wait for dreams anymore. Its voice had changed. It now spoke in Elijah's own cadence, his own breath. But it said things he did not want to hear. You were never singular. Each step you take here is another you breaking. She warned you, but she lied too. You've been here longer than you think. Sometimes the mirror mocked him in his own voice, slightly distorted, drawn out, underwater. Sometimes it tried to soothe, but it never stopped. He no longer knew where the voice was coming from, not from glass, not from the walls. Sometimes it vibrated behind his teeth. Once he heard it from the drain in the kitchen sink. He ventured outside once, just once. He needed to know if the world still existed. It did, but it wasn't the same. The sky seemed thinner. The clouds didn't move. Trees bent too much in the wind, like they were leaning to listen. And the people, God, the people. He passed a woman walking her dog, and she stopped short, eyes wide. She dropped the leash. Her dog began barking wildly. She backed away and whispered something he couldn't hear, over and over again, until she turned and ran. Later that afternoon, a man at the grocery store stared at him for nearly a full minute before asking, "You're not him, are you?" When Elijah asked who, the man just shook his head and muttered, "You shouldn't be out. You shouldn't be." He never returned to town. The house was changing faster now. It had begun growing colder, even in full sun. Frost appeared on the inside of windows. The heat didn't work anymore. Lights dimmed before he entered a room. At midday, the brightness barely resembled morning. Shadows stretched too long across the floor. The silence became unbearable. It wasn't absence. It was anticipation. He started wearing gloves inside, not for warmth, but to keep his skin from touching too much of the house. It responded sometimes, creaked when he sat, sighed when he walked. He wasn't sure how much of it was imagination, but he knew, somewhere deeper, that he was no longer just in the house. He was part of it. And then came the shard. It was late or early. Elijah couldn't tell. He had fallen asleep again in the hallway, too tired to reach his bed. When he awoke, it was to pain. A hot, sharp jolt in his left hand. He sat up slowly, looked down. There was blood in his palm. And something else. He turned his hand. A glint. Just beneath the skin, between the lines of his palm, a shard of glass, no bigger than a fingernail, embedded deep in the flesh. Not a sliver. A piece. Too clean. Too perfect. He pressed the edge of his thumb against it. The shard moved. It pulsed, a slow, steady rhythm. A heartbeat. His own. He wasn't sure. He pressed harder, trying to push it out. It resisted. When he looked closer, he saw that veins had grown around it, like the body had accepted it, welcomed it. He screamed without making a sound. The voice came again, from inside. "You're the frame now. We're almost through. Don't let it fall out." He stumbled to the bathroom, turned the faucet. Nothing but a low groan from the pipes, and then a whisper rising through the drain. "Do you see it yet? Do you see you?" He raised his head slowly, terrified of what would look back at him in the mirror above the sink. It was him, but not him. The version in the mirror was smiling and holding something in its palm, another shard. But this one was pressed against its throat, and it was beginning to push. Chapter 8. What was left behind. The handwriting wasn't his. Not quite. It was close, closer than the last time, but there were inconsistencies in the slant, the pressure. The loops in the G's were tighter. The T's crossed higher, as if by someone taller. Still, Elijah recognized something undeniable beneath the ink, a rhythm of thought, a sequence of obsessions. He was back in the attic, leafing through the journals again. Not his own this time, but the ones he'd found, scattered, buried, hidden beneath loose floorboards, and behind the warped paneling near the chimney. There were 5 so far, each with a name scratched out. all bound in worn leather that smelled faintly of mildew, ash, and something older. They were filled with horror. Some entries rambled. Others were brutally efficient, scrawled in tight script as if time had been running out. There's a mirror that isn't a mirror. Don't look at it. If you see it seeing you, it's already too late. The man in the mirror says he's me, but I think I'm him. They told me the house was abandoned, but I was never alone, not even before I arrived. Elijah flipped a page. This one had been torn and then taped back with something yellow and brittle. The entry was dated March 12th. No year. Another Elijah showed up yesterday. He came through with eyes that didn't blink. We kept him in the basement, but now I think we were wrong. He wasn't the one that crossed. I was. Elijah blinked, heart quickening. Another Elijah. His throat felt dry. He stood up, let the journal fall closed in his lap, and turned to the covered mirror propped against the wall. He hadn't looked in hours. Maybe days. He had started covering it with a sheet again, a futile ritual meant to create space between perception and presence. But that was the lie. There was no space, not anymore. The mirror didn't need to be seen to see. He descended the stairs slowly, the journals under one arm, the house groaning with each footfall as if bracing for something. The hallway clock was ticking again. He hadn't heard it in days. He watched the second hand lurch forward once, then stop. The minute hand trembled. He passed the study. Inside, the light flickered dimly, casting shadows that didn't align with the furniture. One chair, his chair, was turned to face the wall. He hadn't left it that way. He didn't stop walking. In the kitchen, he made coffee without tasting it. He sipped, then forgot he had. He stared at the journal pages spread across the table like crime scene evidence. All of them shared the same recurring phrase, scratched into the margins, underlined in red. You don't leave. You just move deeper in. He closed his eyes, tried to remember the feeling of crossing through the mirror. What had he touched? What had he let in? And more terrifying, what had come back? Was he really back in his world? Or was this just another layer, another veil pulled over his eyes to distract him from the truth? The more he tried to recall the mirror's surface, the less real it seemed. He remembered the cold, the sensation of membranes stretching as he passed, the sound, like wind dragging over glass, but not the moment itself. That moment was gone, swallowed, like memory collapsing inward. The kettle whistled. He hadn't turned it on. That night he dreamed in fragments again, not images, not places, identities. He was a boy once again, running through the hallway with muddy shoes. Then a woman, coughing blood into a sink. Then an old man watching the mirror melt in his hands like mercury. He could feel their lives blooming inside him like tumors. One of them screamed until his jaw cracked open. One of them laughed while stitching a mouth closed. One of them simply wept and begged. They all had his face. He woke gasping. The house silent, his mouth dry, his hand bleeding. He looked down. The shard in his palm pulsed again, once, like a warning. He went to the bathroom, gripping the sink for balance, and looked up. There he was. But something was off. Again. His reflection smiled at him. Elijah didn't. He stood perfectly still. No emotion on his face, no twitch, nothing. The reflection grinned wider, lifting its chin, tilting the head to the side. Elijah remained frozen. A game. A test. He blinked. Slowly. The reflection did not. Then, 5 seconds later, it blinked back. Too late. Far, far too late. Elijah staggered back, knocking over a glass. It shattered against the tile. The reflection didn't move. It just watched him with interest, like a predator in no rush at all. Later, Elijah sat in the attic again. The air was thicker now, heavy with a scent that reminded him of heat and metal. The mirror's sheet had slipped halfway. It was breathing, not audibly, but rhythmically, rising and falling, fogging ever so faintly at the edges, as though it held lungs. He opened one of the older journals. This entry was brief. "We never made it out. None of us. The house is the fracture. The mirror is the keyhole. And we're what leaks through." His breath caught. The walls seemed to contract around him. A thought bloomed in his mind then, horrible and clear. What if the Elijah who returned wasn't the one who left? He stared at his hands. Were they his? The veins looked unfamiliar, the skin too pale. He flexed the fingers, watching how the muscles moved beneath. Slow, like something borrowed. He turned toward the mirror again, and for the first time in days he removed the sheet. He stared, waited. He smiled, held it, and then stopped. The reflection held the smile, held it, held, then smiled wider. Chapter 9. The Blood Mirror. The mirror bled at dawn. A hairline crack, perfectly vertical, had split the center of the glass, running from the gilded top of the frame to the bottom like a spine. From this fracture, quiet at first, almost modest, darkness seeped. Not reflective, not liquid. Something between ink and rot, thick as oil, thin as breath. It pulsed outward like a wound too long ignored. Elijah didn't move. He had been standing there for what felt like hours, days, or longer. Time no longer came in measurable increments. It came in fractures, splinters that caught under the skin. He stared at the crack and thought, it finally broke. And then, or maybe it always was, the attic groaned around him. The floorboards beneath his feet had shifted again, subtle but unmistakable. The slope of the house had changed, as if the structure were slowly bowing, kneeling to something unseen. The air was colder than it had ever been. He pressed his hand to the glass. It was warm. The firstborn stood in the doorway, not having entered, not needing to. He always appeared just at the edge of wherever Elijah's certainty ended. His face, still Elijah's, was older now, sharper. Lines ran through the forehead, the mouth, but they didn't speak of age. They spoke of deformation. "You've lingered," the firstborn said, voice gentle, coaxing. Elijah's throat was too dry to answer. "You were supposed to forget by now." He turned slightly, not enough to face the firstborn. "I didn't. I can see that." The mirror's surface rippled. "I remember everything," Elijah said quietly. "The reflections, the screams, He hesitated. "The woman." The firstborn smiled. "She made the wrong choice. She hesitated. You've lasted longer." "Longer than who?" The firstborn's eyes gleamed. "You know." A silence stretched between them like a drawn blade. The crack had deepened. A thin line of red now glistened along its edge. Not light, not paint, something far too physical. It trickled down slowly, disappearing into the frame, as though being consumed, as though fed. "You're near the edge," the firstborn said, stepping forward. "You've crossed once, but not completely. You're still clinging, still hoping for some tether, some exit. But the house was the crossing. The moment was the key." Elijah's legs felt hollow. His hands ached. He looked down. The shard of glass in his palm throbbed in sync with the pulse of the mirror. A heartbeat. His, or the mirror's? He didn't know anymore. Had he ever known? "I want to leave," he whispered. "You can," the firstborn said. "But not the way you think. Not as you are. Not with memory. That's the price. What happens if I stay? You forget, the firstborn said. Not just this, everything, all of it. You'll wake in the same bed every day, and none of this will ever have happened. No mirrors, no blood, no fractures. But I wouldn't be me. The firstborn's smile widened. You never were. The house began to hum, not a sound, a vibration, low and awful and living. Elijah looked around and saw the wallpaper beginning to peel in slow, fluid strips. The corners of the attic folded inward, as if the angles were melting. The window blinked. A lid of dust and shadow pulled over it like an eye. Time was collapsing, not speeding up, not rewinding, unraveling. Each second became visible, stacking atop one another like translucent slides, each slightly misaligned. Elijah saw himself blinking 3 times at once. He watched his foot move before he intended it to. Choose, the firstborn said. The mirror gurgled behind him. I don't. There is no truth here, Elijah, the firstborn said. Only alignment. You've touched what you shouldn't, seen what doesn't belong. You are the fracture now. You just haven't accepted it. The crack split wider. The blood grew darker. He turned. The mirror was opening. Not physically, not in a way that could be mapped or measured. It was inviting. Something shifted in the air behind the glass. A hallway. The old one. The first place he had seen that wasn't his. The lights blinked down the length of it in rapid succession, like synapses firing in an unfamiliar brain. In the distance, something crawled sideways across the walls, slow, deliberate, segmented. A shriek echoed, layered, and wrong. Something that had once been a human voice, now stretched beyond use. And deeper still, shadows moved with intent. Figures. Some looked like him, some did not. He turned back to the firstborn. I can't go in there. You already did. The heartbeat in his hand quickened. I don't belong there, Elijah said, almost pleading. You don't belong here. The attic flickered. The floor beneath him snapped downward a half-inch. The walls contracted. The house was dying, or birthing something else. And he was still in the middle. The mirror called out without sound. He felt it in his jaw, in his teeth. A pressure, a pull, like gravity bending wrong, like time inviting entropy. Behind the crack, behind the blood, something moved closer. He knew this moment was a loop. He had done this before. He would do it again. It didn't matter what he chose. What mattered was the act, the motion, the step. He raised his foot. The firstborn watched, still smiling. He stepped forward, and as his foot met the mirror's surface, no longer glass but flesh, pulsing and eager, he heard screaming. Not from the house, not from the world beyond, but from inside his own throat. A sound torn from a place he didn't know existed. Ragged, shredded. A scream not of fear, but recognition. Chapter 10. Chronicles of the Forgotten Self. The birdsong was unfamiliar, too clean, too precise. Elijah woke to the sound of it, threading through the morning air like something artificial and curated. He opened his eyes slowly, the ceiling above him unfamiliar, but somehow perfect. Whitewashed beams, spaced evenly. Not a single cobweb, no dust, no decay. He sat up and found himself in a room that did not remember what it had once been. No cracks in the plaster, no rotting furniture, a made bed, a brass lamp on the nightstand, a small vase with 3 pale lilies, not yet wilted. His head throbbed softly, a hangover without cause. The walls held no memories, but his body did. He rubbed his palms together. They felt new, calloused in the wrong places. The mirror across from the bed was spotless. It reflected him in silence. Downstairs, the estate was immaculate. Morning sun poured through freshly cleaned windows. The wooden floors gleamed as though newly polished. Outside, the lawn was trimmed, the hedges trimmed with surgical precision. The trees swayed gently in a rhythm that seemed rehearsed. The kitchen clock ticked evenly. The coffee maker brewed. Everything was in its right place. And yet, Elijah moved through the house with the nervous posture of a man stepping through the dream of someone else. Every surface felt curated, like a set. Every drawer he opened closed with the same soft sigh, the same gentle finality. He opened the fridge. The milk was cold. The date on the carton read April 3rd. He checked his watch. It had returned. It told the same date. A day like any other. Except it wasn't. He found the journal by the fireplace. His journal. It sat open to a blank page, a fountain pen beside it. The leather cover was unmarked, soft with age, but well preserved. The paper smelled faintly of lavender and dust. He flipped back a few pages. Entries dated weeks earlier in his handwriting. Thoughts about cataloging manuscripts, mentions of a local library, descriptions of this house, his house, as if he had lived here for years. None of it triggered recognition. His own words were alien. I spent the morning filing a series of parish records from the late 1800s. The ink patterns were oddly hypnotic. I think I'll refinish the attic floorboards this weekend. They've begun to creak too much in the evenings. I had the strangest dream last night, something about a mirror. I woke with my hand bleeding. That last sentence was underlined 3 times. He stared at it for a long time. When he went to the attic, it was pristine. No vines, no bloodstains, no creeping shadows, just a wide open space filled with light, and the mirror, whole, flawless. Its frame was polished mahogany. The glass shone without a single imperfection, no fingerprints, no breath fog, no pulse. He stood in front of it, unsure whether to speak. His reflection stood with him, perfectly in sync. He raised his hand. It followed. He frowned. It frowned. No delay, no malice, no smile. Just him. That night he didn't sleep easily. The air had a weight to it, as if someone had filled the room with unseen water. His limbs ached. His breath felt thinner. He turned in bed and saw the journal on the nightstand. He hadn't left it there. A single line had been added to the last page. "You've done well." This version holds. The handwriting wasn't his. It wasn't quite anyone's. He closed the journal, locked it in the drawer. Over the next few days, the entries continued. Always just one sentence. Always after he had fallen asleep. The mirror holds its shape. He does not suspect. This cycle is cleaner. No fractures detected. The subject is stabilizing. He is beginning to ask the wrong questions. He stopped writing in the journal altogether. Still, the pages filled. He began to hear the birds less clearly. Sometimes he could swear they repeated themselves, each trill and chirp in a loop, a pattern that restarted every 17 seconds. Once he timed it. The loop never changed. He visited the mirror again on the 7th day. This time it felt colder. His reflection looked back at him as always, obedient, in sync. But the more he stared, the more he noticed something faint, barely perceptible. A soft shimmer around the eyes, as if the reflection had blinked twice, once inside the glass and once outside. He blinked once. The reflection blinked twice. He stepped away. The next morning, a new entry waited. There was a delay. Initiate correction. He tore the page out, burned it in the kitchen sink. It reappeared the following night, Same sentence. His hands began to shake. His heartbeat no longer matched his pulse. He tried to leave. He drove 10 miles out, past the town, to the edge of the forest. At the end of the dirt road, he stepped out, certain he was free, until he noticed the trees. Each trunk had the same notch, the same bark pattern, identical. He walked 10 minutes into the forest. Every tree was the same tree. He walked back to the car. The fuel gauge read 0%. The engine started anyway. He began to talk aloud more often, to test the echo of the house, to gauge its response. Sometimes it answered with silence. Other times, it creaked in acknowledgement. One night he asked, "Am I alone here?" From somewhere above, a door swung shut. He avoided the mirror for days, until he couldn't. It was already in the hallway, then the study, then the kitchen. He stopped covering it. It wasn't worth the effort. The reflection had stopped obeying. It matched him most of the time, but not always. Sometimes it looked toward the stairs when he looked away. Sometimes it smiled in his sleep. He opened the journal again on what he believed was the 10th day. The final entry was already written. "You are not the first. You are not the last." He closed the journal and watched his reflection keep reading.